When did that become okay? I'm not looking for applause right now. I want to ask Republicans out there, people who are conservative, who didn't vote for me, who didn't agree with me on it. I had friends who disagreed with me on every issue. When did that become okay?
Former conservative radio host Charlie Sykes is the latest Republican to say that's not okay and endorse Vice President Kamala Harris in the 2024 election. The Republicans who have thrown their support behind Harris include former Congresswoman Liz Cheney and more than 200 former Bush, McCain, and Romney staffers. But they do not represent the majority of their party by far. This week, Senator Mitt Romney, who was forced to run to safety during the January 6th riot, said that he would not be endorsing the vice president in order to maintain his voice in the GOP. Despite writing an op-ed defending Springfield, Ohio from Trump's xenophobic lies, the state's Republican governor, Mike DeWine, still plans to vote for the Republican ticket. And even though Vice President Dick Cheney has come out against Trump and endorsed Harris, George W. Bush has not. As Susan Glasser writes in The New Yorker, the signature disappointment of this election is not so much the shock of the MAGA thousands cheering Trump at his rallies, but the quieter awfulness of those who knew better and facilitated his return anyway. Joining us now to talk about all of that is Charlie Sykes, former longtime conservative radio host in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, now an MSNBC contributor and Kamala Harris endorser, Susan Glasser, staff writer at The New Yorker, and McKay Coppins, Atlantic staff writer and author of Mitt Romney, A Reckoning. Charlie, I want to start with you. And at one point in your endorsement on air of Kamala Harris, you said it might feel good, it might feel warm and fuzzy to write in George Washington on the ballot, but George Washington is not on the ballot this time. Can you talk a little bit more about the difference you see between Republicans who say they won't vote for Trump and those who come out and actually endorse Kamala Harris?
Yeah, this is the big divide. It's between those who still have that muscle memory of partisanship, who want to stay at the table in the room, who want to stay relevant, who know that Donald Trump is not fit for office, but cannot bring themselves to endorse a Democrat. And the point that I'm making there is that at some point you have a moral obligation to make a choice. If you regard Donald Trump as a real danger to our constitutional republic, there's only one way to keep him from getting back into office. So this is not a normal election. And I guess that's the point that I'm trying to make to conservative centrist voters. This is not Bob Dole versus Bill Clinton. This is not Dukakis versus Bush. This is not about right versus left or about policy difference. I'm going to disagree with Kamala Harris on a lot of different policy issues. But the crisis is posed to the nation by the prospect that a man like Donald Trump will get back into office. Somebody who is a convicted felon, somebody who's been found liable for sexual assault by a jury, someone who tried to overturn a peaceful election, who incited a mob to attack the Capitol, who botched a massive pandemic, who is running on an agenda of pure bigotry. And I understand that it's hard for many people to disenthrall themselves from this, partisan loyalties. But I do think that this is the moment where you have to say, okay, we do need to put country over party. And I think that's the decision that the Cheneys have made. That's the decision that former Senator Jeff Flake made, former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales, many of the people that you mentioned. And I think that that's a challenge. I understand the incredible pressure that Republicans are under not to endorse a progressive Democrat, but sometimes you have to recognize the nature of the moment and of the emergency.
McKay, I am so eager to hear your thoughts on Mitt Romney's calculation here. Mitt Romney, one of the only Republicans who voted to impeach Donald Trump, who does not think he's fit for office, but holding back on endorsing Harris because he wants to be in the room if and when the GOP reinvents itself. Do you have a thought? Do you have any analysis about why he might be making this calculation this way?
Yeah, I mean, I should say up front that we haven't spoken about this. The last interview I had with him was earlier this year when Joe Biden was still the Democratic nominee. And at that point, he told me he was considering endorsing Biden. He hadn't made up his mind. So this is kind of informed speculation based on a lot of time I've spent with him. And, I think that the comments that he made this week were interesting. He talked about wanting to be in a position to have a voice in the GOP, to kind of rebuild from the rubble of the Trump era something new, or a new version of the Republican Party, and that he needed the credibility to do that, and that he thought that if he endorsed Kamala Harris, that would erase any remaining credibility he had. I think that might be part of his calculation here. But he also said in that same conversation, he all but said, it's clear who I would prefer as president. He said, you'll have to make the very difficult calculation, knowing what I've said about Trump, who I think should be the next president. Why he won't go that extra step and just make the formal endorsement, I think, has something to do with how fully he has internalized the idea that Republicans like him just don't have any influence in politics anymore. And that might be a cop-out, but I do think that he genuinely believes, and he said this to me many times over the 2 years we spent together, that his endorsement one way or the other would not move voters. He doesn't believe he would move the needle. He believes that the constituency, the coalition he represents, is a tiny fraction of what is left of the Republican Party, and that they're not going to listen to him anyway. Now, I think the counter to that would be that this race is very close and is going to be won on the margins. And so, any small, needle moving you can do might make a difference. But I think that sense of his own kind of political irrelevance at this moment is part of what's informing his decision.
Yeah, well, you could say if you're irrelevant, that would, in one way, make it easier for you to endorse Kamala Harris. Susan, you call these Republican holdouts the signature disappointments of this election. What do you make of McKay's analysis that it might be in part self-designated, futility on the part of these Republicans and them just not wanting to get involved in the firefight?
We're 9 years into this, Alex, and I have to say it's pretty exhausting and kind of dispiriting to hear that kind of rationalization at this point, 9 years into the Trump era. It's never too late to do the right thing, but it's pretty tiresome to hear people who are retiring or retired already, who have absented themselves from positions of power. I'm thinking of, some former very senior Republican officials, in addition to Romney. We can list their names, who I've heard the very same argument from. Well, nobody cares what I think anyways, or, if I endorsed the Democrat, that would actually just turn off voters. Okay, great. Well, then the stakes are low for you to do what you think is the right thing. So it's kind of exhausting to hear that when so many of the people who worked for those Republicans have stood up at some personal cost to themselves and, just come out and said what they think is right for the country. But I think the broader point right now is that if it was just Donald Trump and the most hardcore of the MAGA faithful, this would not be a competitive election. It would not be a too close to call election. The reason that this conversation matters is because these Republicans who know better, who understand and have been very clear about the problems they've identified with Donald Trump, have nonetheless enabled and facilitated this 9-year hold on our national collective public space. And if those folks would stand up en masse and say to the public what we know they believe, I'm not suggesting that people who disagree with it should, if just the people we know believe that Donald Trump is a threat to the republic would join hands and stand up and say this, maybe we wouldn't have been here for 9 years.
Yeah, Charlie, you were grappling with this. You made this announcement in the last 24 hours. I was so struck by Barack Obama on the stage last night. Not speaking, I think, off of teleprompter. He got choked up. I mean, it almost sounded like he was going to cry for a moment there when he's basically begging the Republicans he used to know with whom he disagreed, but who know better, not to just stand idly by. Can you talk about that moment as a an influential conservative in a state that really matters, and whether you think that resonates with other conservatives who know better in this moment?
Well, I would say formerly influential, but I think that it goes to the memory of saying, remember who you used to be. Yeah. Because all of us here are old enough to remember when certain things would not have been acceptable. The raw bigotry would not have been acceptable. Paying hush money to a porn star would not have been acceptable. The character of someone like Donald Trump would not have been acceptable to the Republican Party. And so he's asked a question that I think has haunted a lot of us. How has this country changed? How did we become this? Because Donald Trump fundamentally has not changed. What changed was the Republican Party, their willingness to shred their values, to abandon their principles in order to go along with him. And I think that there's that moment where you say, we always weren't like this. This is not who you want to be. This is not who you used to think that you were. And it helps immensely when someone like a Liz Cheney or a Dick Cheney or an Alberto Gonzalez stands up and says, look, we are also conservatives. And we're willing to do something. We understand that it's hard for you to vote for somebody like Kamala Harris. You may not know her, or you may have, heard her through the filter of right-wing media. But trust us, this is a choice that you can make. And I know the term, permission has been overused. But when each one of them does this and says you don't have to abandon your values, you have to remember what your values were. So on the margins, it would make a difference. In Wisconsin, there's a tiny sliver of undecided voters. Most of them, it turns out, based on the recent Marquette poll, are independents and Republican-leaning voters who I think are very Trump skeptical. And when they see people stand up and say, look, I share your views on the border, on crime. I share your views on a variety of issues. You don't have to change those principles. But this is not what the election is about. It does make a difference.